London, 1867. A man sits in the reading room of the British Museum, surrounded by mountains of books and documents, government reports, factory inspector accounts, parliamentary testimonies, economic treatises, statistical tables. He has been coming here nearly every day for years, sometimes for 12 hours at a stretch, reading, taking notes, filling notebooks with dense handwriting. His name is Karl Marx. He is 49 years old. He is poor, living in a cramped apartment in Soho, supported by his friend Friedrich Engels, a successful businessman in Manchester. His wife Jenny complains about the poverty, about pawning their possessions to buy food. 3 of their children have died young. Marx himself suffers from painful boils, insomnia, liver problems. He self-medicates with alcohol and tobacco. But none of this stops him from his work. He is writing a book, not just any book. A book he believes will change the world. A book that will expose the secret of modern society, reveal how capitalism actually works, show why workers remain poor while factory owners grow rich, and explain the hidden mechanisms that shape every aspect of life in the industrial age. The book is Das Kapital, in English, Capital. It will take him 23 years to write the first volume. He will die before completing the remaining volumes, leaving Engels to assemble them from his notes. The book is massive, dense, filled with economic theory, historical examples, angry polemics, dark humor, and philosophical insights. It is not an easy read. Even sympathetic readers struggle through it, but it becomes one of the most influential books ever written. It shapes revolutions, inspires movements, terrifies governments, and transforms how millions of people understand their lives. A century and a half after publication, it remains relevant, controversial, and widely misunderstood. Most people know Marx through simplified slogans. Workers of the world, unite. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Religion is the opium of the masses. These phrases have become divorced from their context, repeated by supporters and critics alike without real understanding. And most people think they know what Marx argued, that capitalism is evil, that private property should be abolished, that the state should own everything, that revolution is inevitable, that communism is paradise on earth. But Marx's actual arguments in Capital are far more complex, more surprising, and more interesting than these caricatures suggest. He was not writing a political manifesto. He was conducting a scientific analysis of capitalism as an economic system. He wanted to understand how it worked, not just condemn it. He wanted to reveal its inner logic, trace its historical development, and predict its future trajectory based on its own internal contradictions. Marx begins Capital with a simple question. What is a commodity? This seems almost absurdly basic. A commodity is just something you buy and sell, right? A coat, a bushel of wheat, a table. What could be simpler? But Marx shows that even this basic unit of capitalist economy contains mysteries, paradoxes, hidden relationships that, once understood, illuminate everything else. The commodity is the cell form of capitalism, just as the biological cell is the basic unit of life. Understand the commodity, and you begin to understand the whole system. From this starting point, Marx builds an analysis of staggering scope. He explains why workers cannot escape poverty even in prosperous times. He reveals why economic crises are not aberrations but built into the system. He shows why technology that should liberate workers instead enslaves them. He demonstrates why competition between capitalists leads inexorably to monopoly. He predicts the global expansion of capitalism, its transformation of every society it touches, and he does all this not through moral denunciation, though he certainly finds capitalism morally abhorrent, but through careful logical analysis. He takes capitalism's own premises, its own logic, its own claims about itself, and shows how they lead to conclusions the system's defenders would prefer to avoid. Marx claimed he was doing for political economy what Darwin had done for biology. Darwin showed that species were not fixed creations, but evolved through natural selection. Marx wanted to show that economic systems were not eternal, but evolved through historical processes, and that capitalism itself was just one stage in economic evolution, destined to give way to something new. Whether he succeeded is debated. His predictions have been partly vindicated, partly falsified by history. The communist regimes established in his name often bore little resemblance to what he envisioned. Capitalism proved more adaptable than he expected. Workers in developed countries achieved living standards Marx never imagined possible. But his fundamental insights remain powerful. His analysis of how capital operates, how it transforms human labor into profit, how it shapes social relationships, how it drives endless expansion, these remain relevant. In an age of globalization, financial crisis, inequality, and automation, Marx's questions echo with renewed urgency. Who creates value? Who captures it? Why do some people own the means of production while others must sell their labor to survive? Is this arrangement natural and inevitable, or historically contingent and changeable? What does it mean to be free in a society where most people must work for others to live? Can human beings create a society organized on different principles? These are not just academic questions. They touch the daily reality of billions of people. They shape politics, economics, culture. They determine who has power and who does not, who lives comfortably and who struggles, who has meaningful work and who has drudgery. Marx spent his life grappling with these questions. Capital is his answer. Not a complete answer, not a perfect answer, but a profound and challenging attempt to understand the system that dominates modern life. This is the story of that book. Not just what Marx said, but why he said it, how he developed his ideas, what he was trying to accomplish, and why his work continues to matter. It is a story about labor and value, about exploitation and accumulation, about the hidden structures that shape our world. The mystery of the commodity. Marx begins Capital with a sentence that seems straightforward but contains depths. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. What is a commodity? Marx defines it as something produced not for the producer's own use, but for exchange. A peasant who grows wheat to feed his family is not producing a commodity, but a farmer who grows wheat to sell at market is producing a commodity. The difference matters. Pre-capitalist societies had commodities, of course. People traded goods. But in capitalism, nearly everything becomes a commodity. Not just goods, but services, land, even human labor power itself. The commodity form dominates. Understanding it is essential. Every commodity has two aspects. First, it has use value. It satisfies some human need or want. A coat keeps you warm. Wheat feeds you. A table gives you a surface to work on. Use value is about the physical properties of things, what they can do, how they serve human purposes. But in capitalism, commodities also have exchange value. They can be traded for other commodities in definite proportions. One coat might exchange for 20 bushels of wheat. 10 bushels of wheat might exchange for one table. These exchange ratios seem arbitrary but follow definite patterns. What determines exchange value? The obvious answer is supply and demand. When coats are scarce, their price rises. When wheat is abundant, its price falls. This is true but not the whole story. Supply and demand explain short-term fluctuations. They do not explain why a coat generally exchanges for 20 bushels of wheat rather than 2 or 200. Underneath the fluctuations, Marx argues, there must be something that makes different commodities commensurable, that allows them to be compared and exchanged. What is this common element? Not use value. A coat and wheat satisfy completely different needs. They cannot be compared in terms of usefulness, yet they exchange at definite ratios. Marx's answer is labor. Commodities contain human labor. A coat requires someone to shear sheep, spin wool, weave cloth, cut and sew. Wheat requires someone to plow, plant, tend, harvest. What makes commodities exchangeable is that they are all products of human labor, but not any labor. The specific concrete labors that produce different things are incomparable. Tailoring is different from farming. You cannot compare them directly. What matters is abstract labor, human labor in general, the expenditure of human energy regardless of its specific form. The value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce it. Not the actual time any individual worker takes, but the average time needed with typical skill and equipment. If it takes 10 hours to make a coat and half an hour to grow a bushel of wheat, then one coat exchanges for 20 bushels of wheat. This is the labor theory of value. It was not original to Marx. Classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo had developed versions of it. But Marx pushes it further, uses it more rigorously, and draws more radical conclusions. The labor theory immediately raises questions. What about natural resources? Land, minerals, water? These have value but contain no labor. Marx acknowledges this but argues that in their natural state, these things are free. They only gain value when labor transforms them into commodities. The value of a lump of iron ore reflects the labor of mining it, not the ore itself. What about differences in skill? An hour of skilled labor produces more value than an hour of unskilled labor. Marx agrees and says skilled labor counts as multiplied simple labor. Training, education, and talent create labor power of greater intensity. What about machines? A coat made by machine takes less labor than one made by hand. True, says Marx, which is why mechanization reduces the value of commodities. But machines themselves embody past labor. Their value transfers into the products they help create. What matters is that Marx has identified something fundamental. In capitalism, human labor creates value. Everything else, raw materials, tools, buildings, is either free natural wealth or embodied past labor. Living human labor is the source of new value. This seems abstract. Who cares about theories of value? But Marx is laying groundwork, because if labor creates value, then several questions arise. Who controls labor? Who owns what labor produces? How is the value created by labor distributed? These questions lead directly to Marx's analysis of exploitation. Labor power as commodity. Here, Marx makes his most original and disturbing observation. Under capitalism, labor itself becomes a commodity. Not labor as such, but labor power, the capacity to work. In pre-capitalist societies, most people worked for themselves. Peasants farmed their own land. Artisans owned their workshops. They might trade their products, but they did not sell their capacity to work. Capitalism is different. Most people do not own means of production. They do not have land to farm, workshops to craft in, factories to operate. To survive, they must sell their labor power to those who do own these things. They must become wage laborers. This is the defining feature of capitalism for Marx. Not markets, not money, not even private property in general. Previous societies had all these. What makes capitalism unique is the existence of a large class of people who must sell their labor power to survive, and another class who purchases labor power and sets it to work. Marx calls the first class the proletariat. The second class, the bourgeoisie or capitalists. These are not just economic categories. They are social relationships. You cannot understand capitalism by looking at individuals in isolation. You must understand the relationships between classes. How does the capitalist make profit? Here is the key. The capitalist buys labor power at its value. Like any commodity, labor power has a value determined by the labor time needed to produce it. What does it take to produce labor power? Food, clothing, shelter, education, everything needed to create and maintain a worker capable of laboring. Suppose this costs 6 hours of labor per day. The capitalist pays wages equivalent to 6 hours. But here is the trick. The capitalist does not buy 6 hours of labor. He buys labor power for a full working day, and that working day might be 12 hours or 14 or 16. So the worker labors 6 hours to produce value equal to his wages, but he does not stop working. He continues for another 6, 8, 10 hours. This additional labor, labor beyond what is needed to reproduce labor power, Marx calls surplus labor. The value it creates is surplus value. Surplus value is the source of profit. The capitalist pays for 6 hours of labor power, but gets 12 hours of actual labor. The extra 6 hours cost the capitalist nothing. The value they create belongs to the capitalist, not because of any law of nature, but because the capitalist owns the means of production, and therefore controls what gets produced and who gets what. This is exploitation in Marx's technical sense. Not necessarily cruelty or oppression, though capitalism certainly includes those. Exploitation means extracting surplus value from workers, paying them less than the value they create, appropriating the difference. Every capitalist system involves this. A worker produces, say, $100 of value per day. He receives $50 in wages. The other $50 becomes profit, though it may be divided among the capitalist, landlords, bankers, and others. But the fundamental source is unpaid labor. Marx does not claim this is robbery in the ordinary sense. The capitalist pays the agreed wage. The exchange is fair according to capitalism's own rules. This is what makes exploitation systematic rather than incidental. It is built into the structure of the system. As long as some people own means of production and others must sell labor power, exploitation is inevitable. Defenders of capitalism object. The capitalist takes risks. The capitalist provides capital. The capitalist deserves profit. Marx's response is to ask, where did the capital come from originally? It came from past surplus value, from previous exploitation, from wealth accumulated through a long historical process he calls primitive accumulation. The capitalist's capital is itself the product of unpaid labor, going back generations. And what of risk? Yes, individual capitalists may lose money, but the capitalist class as a whole profits systematically. Risk is distributed unequally. Workers risk injury, unemployment, poverty. Capitalists risk losing some of their capital. The stakes are not comparable. What of the claim that capitalists provide jobs? Marx would say this reverses reality. Workers provide the labor that creates everything. Capitalists control access to means of production, forcing workers to labor on capitalist terms. Saying capitalists provide jobs is like saying feudal lords provided serfs with land to work. Technically true, but it obscures the fundamental power relationship. The crucial point is that exploitation does not depend on individual moral failings. A capitalist might be generous, pay well, treat workers kindly, but as long as he operates as a capitalist, extracting profit, he must exploit. The system requires it. Competition forces it. A capitalist who does not extract sufficient surplus value will be outcompeted by those who do. This is why Marx sees capitalism as a system, not just a collection of individual choices. The system has its own logic, its own imperatives, its own dynamics. Individual capitalists and workers are caught in it, acting out roles the system assigns them. The working day and the struggle over time. If surplus value comes from workers laboring beyond the time needed to reproduce their labor power, then the length of the working day becomes crucial. The longer workers labor, the more surplus value they produce. This creates a fundamental conflict. Capitalists want to extend the working day as long as possible. Workers want to limit it. The struggle over the working day is not incidental but central to capitalism. Marx documents this struggle in harrowing detail. He quotes factory inspector reports from mid-19th century England. Children working 16-hour days in textile mills. Women collapsing from exhaustion. Men dying from industrial diseases. Entire families sleeping in shifts because they work different hours in the same factory. The conditions are not just harsh, they are murderous. Marx quotes doctors, coroners, government officials, all testifying to how factory labor destroys health, shortens lives, cripples bodies. Workers in their 30s have the physical condition of people twice their age. Why do capitalists push so hard? Not necessarily because they are cruel, though some certainly are, but because competition compels them. A capitalist who limits working hours while competitors do not will produce less, profit less, potentially go bankrupt. The system punishes humanity, but workers resist. They form unions, they strike, they riot, they petition parliament. Slowly, painfully, they win limits. The Factory Acts in England gradually restrict working hours, first for children, then for women, eventually for all workers. Marx analyzes these laws carefully. They represent something unprecedented: legal limits on exploitation. The state intervenes to restrict how much surplus value capitalists can extract. This does not end exploitation, but moderates it. Why does the state intervene? Not from benevolence, but because unrestricted exploitation threatens the working class's physical reproduction. Work people to death, and you run out of workers. Even from capitalism's perspective, some limits are necessary. The Factory Acts also show something important about class struggle. Change is possible. Workers can win concessions. The system is not immutable. But change requires organization, struggle, political pressure. It does not come from capitalist goodwill or market forces. It comes from workers fighting for it. But there is a twist. Limits on the working day force capitalists to find other ways to increase surplus value. If they cannot extend the working day, they must intensify labor. Make workers produce more in the same time. This requires technology, new methods, reorganization of work. It drives what Marx calls the real subsumption of labor under capital. Initially, capitalism just takes existing craft production and employs it for profit. A capitalist might hire 10 tailors to make coats much as they always did, just now working for wages. This is formal subsumption. The labor process itself is not transformed. But competition drives innovation. Capitalists who can produce more efficiently win. This means revolutionizing production, breaking down craft skills into simple repetitive tasks, introducing machinery, organizing workers into factory systems, creating entirely new ways of working. This is real subsumption. Now, capitalism does not just employ existing labor processes, it transforms them, reshapes them according to its own logic. Workers no longer control how they work. The machine's rhythm dictates the pace. Management determines methods. Workers become appendages to machinery. This transformation is not just economic but social and psychological. It changes what it means to work, what skills matter, how workers relate to their labor. Craft pride becomes irrelevant when you perform one small repetitive task. Traditional skills become obsolete when machines do the work. Independence vanishes when you must follow management directives exactly. Marx sees this with ambivalence. On one hand, the factory system is dehumanizing, reducing workers to machine tenders, destroying autonomy. On the other hand, it creates preconditions for socialism. It socializes production, brings workers together, demonstrates that collective production is possible. It also develops productive forces to levels that could provide abundance for all. The tragedy is that these developments occur under capitalist control, for profit, not human need. Technology that could liberate becomes a tool of domination. Collective production enriches capitalists, not workers. Abundance remains potential, not actual, because capitalism distributes based on ability to pay, not need. Machinery and modern industry. Marx devotes an entire chapter to machinery, and it reveals his complex relationship with technology. He is neither techno-optimist nor Luddite. He sees machines as embodiments of human knowledge and ingenuity that, under capitalism, become instruments of exploitation. A machine does not create new value. This follows from the labor theory of value. Only living labor creates value. Machines transfer their own value, created by past labor, into products. A machine worth $10,000 that lasts 10 years transfers $1,000 of value per year into products. But machines dramatically increase productivity. One worker with a power loom produces far more cloth than one with a hand loom. This does not mean the power loom worker creates more value per hour. It means each unit of cloth contains less labor, therefore less value. This has paradoxical effects. Mechanization should make products cheaper, benefiting everyone. And in one sense it does. Cloth becomes less expensive, more people can afford it. Living standards rise, but the benefits are distributed unequally. Capitalists who adopt new machinery first gain temporary advantage. They produce at lower cost than competitors, but sell at prevailing prices. This extra profit, Marx calls it surplus profit, incentivizes innovation. Eventually, competitors adopt the same technology. Prices fall to reflect the new lower value. Surplus profit disappears. But now another problem emerges. With each unit containing less value, capitalists must sell more units to realize the same total profit. This drives expansion, overproduction, crisis. Meanwhile, workers face displacement. Machines replace human labor. Some workers lose jobs. Others must accept lower wages because machines make their skills obsolete. The reserve army of unemployed grows, depressing wages further. Marx famously describes the reserve army of labor as functional for capitalism. Unemployment is not a bug but a feature. It disciplines workers. When jobs are scarce, workers cannot demand higher wages. They must accept what is offered. The threat of replacement keeps them compliant. This is morally appalling but systemically logical. Capitalism needs unemployment. Full employment would give workers too much bargaining power. Wages would rise, cutting into profits. The system functions by maintaining a permanent pool of unemployed or underemployed workers. Technology, which should liberate, becomes a weapon against workers. This is not because machines are inherently oppressive. In a different social system, organized for human need rather than profit, the same machines could reduce necessary labor, freeing people for other pursuits. Under capitalism, they increase exploitation. Marx tells stories of particular industries, showing how mechanization transforms work. The pottery industry, cotton spinning, iron foundries. Each story reveals similar patterns: initial resistance from workers, gradual adoption driven by competition, transformation of the labor process, de-skilling of workers, intensification of effort, decline of wages relative to productivity. He also documents how child labor expands with mechanization. Machines do not require adult male strength. Children and women can operate them. This brings entire families into factories, all working long hours for low pay. Family life dissolves. Children grow up stunted physically and mentally. The human cost is staggering. Yet Marx insists this is not inevitable. The problem is not technology, but who controls it and for what purpose. Under worker control, organized for social benefit, the same productive forces could create genuine freedom. This possibility haunts his entire analysis. The secret of primitive accumulation. If capitalism is based on exploitation, extracting surplus value from workers, then how did it start? Where did the first capital come from? This is what Marx calls the problem of primitive accumulation. The question matters because capitalism's defenders often justify it through a story. Thrifty, industrious individuals saved money, started businesses, employed others. Their wealth is deserved because they earned it through hard work and wise investment. Marx calls this a fairy tale. The real history is far darker. Capital did not arise from saving and hard work. It arose from violence, theft, and coercion. He devotes several chapters to documenting this history in England, where capitalism developed first. The story begins with the enclosure of common lands. For centuries, English peasants had access to common lands where they could graze animals, gather firewood, supplement their farming. These commons were crucial to peasant survival. Beginning in the 16th century, landlords enclosed these lands, claiming them as private property. They evicted peasants, fenced fields, converted land from farming to sheep raising, which required less labor but produced valuable wool. Peasants lost their means of survival. They became landless, with nothing to sell but their labor. This was not a peaceful economic transition. It was violent expropriation. Laws were passed criminalizing vagabondage, forcing displaced peasants to work for wages or face prison, branding, even execution. The state enforced the creation of a working class through terror. Simultaneously, colonial conquest and slave trade generated enormous wealth that flowed back to Europe. Spanish gold and silver from the Americas, sugar from Caribbean plantations worked by enslaved Africans, spices and textiles from India extracted through East India Company monopolies. This wealth did not arise from trade between equals. It arose from conquest, plunder, enslavement. Marx writes with barely contained rage about these origins. The polite language of political economy conceals oceans of blood. Capital, he says, comes into the world dripping with blood and dirt from head to toe. Why does this matter? Because it reveals that capitalism's foundation is not voluntary exchange, but violent dispossession. The freedom of workers to sell their labor is the freedom of people who have been robbed of alternatives. They are free only in the double sense. Free from feudal bonds, but also free from means of production, therefore compelled to work for others. Once established, capitalism reproduces itself. Workers receive wages, spend them on necessities, return to work. Capitalists receive profits, reinvest them in expanding production. The system perpetuates without requiring ongoing violence, though violence remains available when needed. But the origin matters morally and politically. If capitalism's foundation is theft and violence, then the property rights it defends are not natural or sacred. They are historical, contingent, potentially changeable. What was taken by force might be taken back. The general law of capitalist accumulation. As capitalism develops, certain patterns emerge. Marx tries to identify these patterns, to discern laws of motion analogous to physical laws. The most important is the law of capitalist accumulation. Capitalists do not just want profit, they want expanding profit. They must accumulate, must grow, must reinvest surplus value into expanding production. Why? Competition. Capitalists who do not accumulate fall behind. Those who do gain advantage. Scale matters. Larger operations are more efficient. They can afford better machinery, buy inputs cheaper, undersell competitors. Small producers get squeezed out. Capital concentrates in fewer hands. This process Marx calls the concentration and centralization of capital. Concentration means individual capitals grow larger through accumulating surplus value. Centralization means separate capitals merge through buyouts, bankruptcies, monopolization. Both processes drive toward big capital. Marx predicts this will continue. Capitalism tends toward monopoly, not competition. The many small producers of early capitalism give way to giant corporations. This prediction has proven largely accurate. Modern capitalism is dominated by massive multinational corporations, not small businesses. But accumulation has another consequence. As capitalists invest in machinery and technology, the proportion of capital spent on machines versus wages changes. Marx calls capital spent on machinery and materials constant capital because it just transfers existing value. Capital spent on wages he calls variable capital because living labor creates new value, including surplus value. As mechanization progresses, the ratio of constant to variable capital rises. Marx calls this the rising organic composition of capital. More is spent on machines relative to wages. This creates a problem. If only living labor creates surplus value, but capitalists employ relatively less living labor, then the rate of profit tends to fall. This is Marx's famous law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit. Note the word tendential. It is a tendency, not an absolute law. Countervailing factors exist. More intense exploitation, longer working days, cheaper raw materials, colonial superprofits, but the tendency operates underneath these factors. The falling rate of profit has enormous implications. It means capitalism faces an internal contradiction. The very process that makes individual capitalists successful, adopting labor-saving technology, undermines the system's overall profitability. Capitalism creates its own barriers. This tendency manifests in crises. Periodically, capitalism goes into crisis. Production contracts, unemployment rises, businesses fail, wealth is destroyed. These crises are not external shocks but internal to the system. Marx traces the cycle. During booms, capital accumulates rapidly. Production expands. Workers are employed. Wages may even rise. But expansion eventually outpaces the market's ability to purchase products. Overproduction occurs. Unsold goods pile up. Capitalists cut production. Workers lose jobs. A crisis begins. The crisis destroys capital. Failed businesses close. Machinery sits idle. Unemployment creates the reserve army again. Eventually, conditions change. Surviving capitalists buy up failed businesses cheaply. With wages depressed, profitability recovers. A new cycle begins. Each cycle concentrates capital further. Small producers disappear. Large capitals grow. The working class grows both in numbers and in degradation. Marx predicts the polarization of society. The middle classes get squeezed. Society divides into a shrinking capitalist class and a growing proletariat. Alongside this, wealth and poverty both increase. Society grows richer in total productive capacity. But workers' share does not grow proportionately. They may be absolutely better off than before, able to consume more, but relatively worse off compared to capitalists. The gap widens. This is the law of capitalist accumulation. Accumulation of wealth at one pole, accumulation of misery at the other. The richer the society, the more stark the contrast. Mansions and slums coexist. Abundance and hunger sit side by side. This is not a moral failure, but a systemic outcome. The reproduction of capital in social classes. Marx asks a question that seems simple, but is profound. How does capitalism reproduce itself? Not just physically. producing goods but socially, maintaining the relationships that define it? Every society must reproduce itself. People must eat, so food must be produced. But capitalism must also reproduce itself as capitalism. It must maintain the division between capitalists and workers. It must ensure workers continue to sell labor power. It must perpetuate the whole system. This happens partly through economics. Workers spend wages on necessities, returning money to capitalists. Capitalists use profits to expand production, employing more workers. The cycle continues. Each circuit of capital reproduces the conditions for the next. But reproduction is also social and ideological. Workers must believe the system is natural, inevitable, perhaps even just. They must accept that selling their labor is freedom, that capitalists deserve their wealth, that alternatives are impossible or undesirable. Marx discusses how capitalism shapes consciousness. People understand their lives through categories capitalism provides. Wages seem like payment for labor, not for labor power. Profit seems like capital's natural reward, not appropriated surplus value. Exchange seems fair because prices are agreed upon, obscuring exploitation in production. This is what later Marxists call ideology, though Marx does not use the term systematically. Capitalism presents itself as natural and eternal. Its specific historical form appears as universal human nature. Greed, competition, individualism seem like timeless features of humanity rather than products of particular social relations. But material realities contradict ideology. Workers experience exploitation directly. They know they produce more than they receive. They feel the indignity of subordination. They see the waste and irrationality of crisis. This creates potential for class consciousness, for recognizing that their interests oppose capitalists. Marx believed workers would eventually develop revolutionary consciousness, not automatically, but through struggle, through organization, through recognizing their collective power. The working class, he argued, is capitalism's gravedigger. The system creates and concentrates the force that will overthrow it. Whether this is inevitable is debatable. History has been more complex than Marx anticipated, but his point remains. Capitalism depends on workers selling labor power. If workers refuse, if they demand control over production, if they organize to transform the system, capitalism faces an existential threat. The limits and contradictions of capital. As Marx nears the end of his analysis, he emphasizes capitalism's internal contradictions. The system works but generates problems it cannot solve. The first contradiction is between social production and private appropriation. Production is social. Modern industry requires coordination of thousands of workers, intricate supply chains, scientific knowledge. No individual produces anything alone. Yet appropriation is private. Profits go to individual capitalists, not to society. This contradiction manifests in crises. Production is organized for profit, not need. If profitable markets are saturated, production stops, even if human needs remain unmet. Food is destroyed while people starve. Housing sits empty while people are homeless. The rationality of production conflicts with the irrationality of the system. The second contradiction is between development of productive forces and existing social relations. Capitalism develops productivity spectacularly. It revolutionizes technology, science, organization. But these developments strain against capitalist relations. They make capitalist control increasingly obsolete. Giant corporations already socialize production internally. They plan, coordinate, organize rationally. But this planning is subordinated to profit. It cannot extend across society because that would require abolishing private property and market competition. Marx suggests productive forces will eventually outgrow capitalist relations. The system will become a fetter on further development. This will create pressure for transformation, for new social relations matching the developed productive forces. The third contradiction is between capital's need for workers and its tendency to displace them. Capital needs workers to exploit, but competition drives capitalists to reduce labor costs through technology. This creates the reserve army, which is functional for discipline, but problematic for realization. If workers cannot buy products, who will? This is the crisis of overproduction. Capital produces more than can be profitably sold. Markets become saturated. Production contracts. The system lurches from boom to bust, never finding stable equilibrium. These contradictions are not external problems that could be fixed by better policy or wiser management. They are inherent to capitalism's structure. They arise from its basic logic, from the drive to accumulate, from the exploitation of labor, from the anarchy of market competition. Marx believed these contradictions would intensify as capitalism developed. The system would face increasingly severe crises. The working class would grow larger, more concentrated, more organized. Eventually, the conditions for revolutionary transformation would mature. The vision of communist society. Marx does not spend much time in Capital describing the future communist society. His focus is analyzing capitalism, but scattered throughout are hints about what might replace it. First, communism would abolish private ownership of means of production. Factories, land, resources would be collectively owned. This does not mean the state owns everything, though some later communists interpreted it that way. Marx envisions workers' collective ownership, democratic control of production. Second, production would be for use, not profit. Society would decide democratically what to produce based on human needs. The anarchy of the market would be replaced by conscious planning. Crises of overproduction would end because production would be coordinated with consumption. Third, the division between mental and manual labor would erode. Under capitalism, some people think, others do. Managers plan, workers execute. This division reflects and reinforces class power. In communist society, everyone would participate in both thinking and doing. Work would become more varied, more fulfilling. Fourth, labor time would be reduced. Capitalism uses technology to intensify exploitation. Communism would use it to reduce necessary labor. Marx imagines a society where people work a few hours daily, spending the rest on freely chosen activities, art, science, sport, socializing, whatever brings fulfillment. Fifth, distribution would follow the principle, from each according to ability to each according to need. People would contribute what they can and take what they need. This requires abundance, which developed productive forces make possible. It also requires new consciousness, overcoming the selfishness capitalism encourages. Marx distinguishes between lower and higher phases of communism. The lower phase emerges directly from capitalism. Scarcity still exists. Distribution might still follow labor contribution. People receive in proportion to what they give. This maintains some inequality. But as productive forces develop further, society moves to the higher phase. Abundance becomes possible. The principle of contribution fades. People receive according to need regardless of contribution. Labor becomes life's prime want, not just a means to earn a living. The state, which is an instrument of class rule, withers away because classes have been abolished. This vision inspired millions, but also raised questions. Is human nature compatible with such a society? Can abundance really be achieved? Can selfishness be overcome? Would people work without material incentives? Can society function without markets and prices to coordinate activity? Marx's answer would be that human nature is not fixed, but shaped by social conditions. Capitalism creates competitive, selfish individuals because the system rewards those traits. Different social relations would cultivate different traits: cooperation, solidarity, creativity. As for abundance, Marx believed capitalism had already created the productive capacity for it. The problem is not production, but distribution. We can already produce enough for everyone. We choose not to distribute it because that would not be profitable. And people would work because fulfilling work is intrinsically satisfying. The problem under capitalism is not that people are lazy, but that work is alienating, controlled by others, disconnected from workers' own purposes. Free people in a free society would engage in productive activity eagerly. Alienation and human freedom. Though Capital focuses on economics, underlying it is a philosophical vision about human freedom and flourishing. Marx's early writings discuss alienation extensively. The concept remains implicit in Capital. Alienation has several dimensions. First, workers are alienated from the products they create. They produce goods they do not own, cannot control, often cannot afford. The carpenter builds tables for someone else. The factory worker assembles products shipped to unknown buyers. There is no connection between producer and product. Second, workers are alienated from the act of production itself. Work is not freely chosen activity expressing creativity and skill. It is forced labor, sold to survive. The work is controlled by others, following their directions, serving their purposes. Workers become instruments, not free agents. Third, workers are alienated from their species being, from what makes humans distinctively human. Marx believed humans are creative, purposeful beings who realize themselves through transforming the world. But under capitalism, this creative capacity is reduced to mere survival. Workers do not develop their full human potential. They are treated as replaceable parts. Fourth, workers are alienated from each other. Capitalism sets workers in competition. They compete for jobs, promotions, recognition. Solidarity is difficult because the system rewards individual advancement. The collective nature of production is obscured by competitive individualism. All these forms of alienation arise from the separation of workers from means of production. Because workers do not own what they work with, they cannot control how or what they produce. They must sell themselves to those who do own means of production. Freedom under capitalism is therefore limited and contradictory. Workers are legally free, not slaves or serfs. They can change jobs, negotiate wages, quit if they want. But this freedom is formal, not real. The underlying compulsion to work for wages to survive remains. Real freedom would require control over one's productive activity, ability to develop one's capacities, meaningful participation in collective decisions affecting one's life. It would require abundance sufficient that basic needs are met without compulsion. It would require social relations based on cooperation rather than domination. Communism, for Marx, is not just about economic redistribution. It is about creating conditions for genuine human freedom. It is about ending alienation, allowing people to realize their full potential, creating a society where free development of each is the condition for free development of all. This philosophical vision distinguishes Marx from mere reformism. He is not just advocating higher wages or better working conditions, though he supports those. He is advocating transformation of the entire social order, creation of new forms of life where human beings can finally be free. The role of class struggle. Marx is famous for saying, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle." This appears in the Communist Manifesto, but the idea pervades capital. Class struggle is not incidental to capitalism. It is central. The relationship between capital and labor is inherently antagonistic. Their interests conflict fundamentally. What benefits workers, higher wages, shorter hours, better conditions, comes at the expense of profits. What benefits capitalists, longer hours, lower wages, intensified work, comes at workers' expense. This does not mean individual capitalists and workers cannot be friendly, or that they always recognize their antagonistic positions. Much of daily life obscures the fundamental conflict. But the conflict exists structurally. The system pits classes against each other. Class struggle takes many forms: individual resistance, slowing down work, sabotage, quitting. Collective action, strikes, unions, boycotts, political movements, working class parties, socialist organizations, revolutionary movements. Cultural resistance, songs, stories, alternative institutions. Marx documents these struggles throughout Capital. English factory workers fighting for the 10-hour day. Printers resisting mechanization. Miners striking for better pay. These are not asides but central to his analysis. Class struggle shapes capitalism's development. Sometimes struggle wins concessions. The Factory Acts limited exploitation. Unions raised wages. Political pressure created social programs. These victories are real and important. They improve workers' lives. But Marx argues that reforms within capitalism have limits. As long as the basic structure remains, capitalists own means of production, and workers sell labor power, exploitation continues. Reforms can moderate it, but not end it. This leads to Marx's revolutionary politics. He believed capitalism could not be gradually reformed into something qualitatively different. its fundamental logic would reassert itself. Real transformation required revolution, overthrowing capitalist property relations and creating new ones based on collective ownership. Revolution need not be violent, though Marx expected it often would be because ruling classes rarely surrender power peacefully. But violence was not the point. The point was fundamental transformation of property relations and social organization. Marx also believed revolution required class consciousness. Workers must recognize their common interests, understand the system's nature, organize collectively. Revolution is not automatic. It requires political education, organization, leadership. He saw his own work as contributing to this. Capital was not just academic analysis. It was a weapon in class struggle, revealing capitalism's secrets, arming workers with knowledge of how the system worked and how it might be changed. The question of historical inevitability. A controversial aspect of Marx's thought is whether he believed communism was historically inevitable. He uses language suggesting laws of history, tendencies built into capitalism's structure pointing toward its transcendence. Some Marxists embraced determinism. History marches toward communism regardless of individual action. Capitalism will inevitably collapse under its contradictions. The proletariat will inevitably become revolutionary. Communism is guaranteed by historical laws. This determinism has problems. It makes political action seem unnecessary. If history inevitably leads to communism, why struggle? It also makes Marxism unfalsifiable. If communism does not arrive, determinists can always say the time has not yet come. Marx himself was more ambiguous. He identified tendencies and contradictions, but also emphasized human agency. Class struggle, he said, could result in either revolutionary transformation or mutual ruin. History creates possibilities, but does not guarantee outcomes. His method was dialectical. Systems contain contradictions. These contradictions develop, intensify, create crises. Crises create opportunities for transformation. But whether transformation occurs depends on subjective factors: organization, consciousness, leadership, political action. Capitalism has tendencies toward crisis, concentration, polarization. These create conditions for revolution. But revolution is not automatic. It requires the working class to recognize its situation, organize collectively, develop revolutionary consciousness, and act. Marx seems to have believed that capitalism would eventually become unsustainable, that its contradictions would intensify beyond management. But he also believed human beings make their own history, albeit not in circumstances of their own choosing. The tension between determinism and voluntarism runs through his work. Sometimes he emphasizes structural forces. Sometimes he emphasizes conscious action. Perhaps both are true. Structure creates possibilities. Agency realizes or fails to realize them. The unfinished project. Marx died in 1883 with Capital incomplete. He published only the first volume. Engels assembled the second and third volumes from manuscripts, publishing them after Marx's death. A fourth volume on theories of surplus value was published even later. Even as published, Capital was unfinished. Marx planned additional volumes on the state, on international trade, on world markets. He never wrote them. His health declined. Personal tragedies distracted him. The work was overwhelming. What we have is a magnificent torso, a fragment of a larger vision, but it is a systematic fragment. The first volume analyzes production, how surplus value is extracted. The second volume analyzes circulation, how capital moves through its circuits. The third volume analyzes distribution, how surplus value is divided among capitalists, landlords, financiers. Together, they provide a comprehensive analysis of capitalism as a system. Not complete, not perfect, but remarkably coherent and insightful. The incompleteness matters because Marx's analysis evolved. His early works emphasized different themes than later ones. He changed his mind, refined positions, developed new insights. We cannot assume his final position on all questions. This creates space for interpretation and debate among Marxists. What would Marx have said about imperialism, about finance capital, about the state, about ecology? We can extrapolate from what he wrote, but we cannot know for certain. It also means Marx's work is not a closed system, but an open project. Later thinkers have extended, modified, sometimes rejected his ideas. Marxism became a tradition, not a fixed doctrine. Some extensions proved fruitful. Lenin's analysis of imperialism, Gramsci's theory of hegemony, Luxemburg's work on accumulation. These built on Marx while addressing new developments. Other developments diverged sharply. Soviet Marxism ossified into dogma. Maoism adapted Marx to peasant societies. Eurocommunism sought democratic paths to socialism. Each claimed Marx's mantle while transforming his ideas. This history shows both Marx's influence and his ideas' malleability. He inspired the 20th century's major revolutionary movements, but those movements often departed from his vision, sometimes disastrously. The Soviet Union claimed to be Marxist, but became a bureaucratic dictatorship. China's Great Leap Forward caused famine. Cambodia's Khmer Rouge committed genocide. All claim Marx's authority while perpetrating horrors he never advocated. This raises difficult questions. Were these betrayals of Marx, or did they follow from his ideas? Did his emphasis on revolution encourage violence? Did his belief in historical laws justify authoritarianism? Or were these perversions, distortions, crimes committed against his true vision? There are no easy answers. Marx's work is complex, sometimes contradictory, open to interpretation. He advocated revolutionary transformation, but also democratic participation. He emphasized class struggle, but also human solidarity. He criticized capitalism fiercely, but also admired its productive achievements. Marx's enduring relevance. What Marx got right, Mesut. More than 150 years after Capital was published, which of Marx's insights remain valid? First, his analysis of exploitation. Regardless of terminology, the basic insight holds. Those who own means of production capture much of the value created by those who work. Wealth concentrates at the top not primarily through innovation or hard work, but through control of productive assets and ability to extract surplus value from workers. Second, his understanding of capitalism as a system. Capitalism is not just individual choices in markets. It is a totality with its own logic, imperatives, dynamics. Understanding it requires analyzing relationships between classes, structures of ownership, patterns of accumulation. Third, his recognition that capitalism is historical, not eternal. It emerged from specific historical conditions. It transforms societies it enters. It creates contradictions that may lead to its transcendence. Treating capitalism as natural and inevitable obscures its contingency. Fourth, his analysis of crises. Crises are not external shocks, but internal to capitalism. They arise from contradictions between production and consumption, from overaccumulation, from falling profitability. The 2008 financial crisis vindicated much of Marx's crisis theory. Fifth, his prediction of concentration and centralization. Capitalism does tend toward monopoly. Giant corporations dominate modern economies. Small businesses struggle. Market competition erodes as big capital consolidates. Marx saw this clearly. Sixth, his analysis of globalization. Marx predicted capitalism would become a world system, spreading across the globe, transforming all societies, creating international interdependence. This has obviously occurred. Seventh, his critique of alienation. Modern work remains largely alienating for most people. Workers lack control over their labor, produce for others' purposes, feel disconnected from products and from meaningful creative activity. Eighth, his emphasis on class struggle. Economic conflicts remain central to politics. Battles over wages, working conditions, social programs, taxation reflect underlying class interests. Pretending these conflicts do not exist does not make them disappear. What Marx got wrong. But Marx also made predictions that have not been borne out or held views now seen as problematic. First, the immiseration thesis. Marx predicted workers under capitalism would become absolutely poorer. This has not occurred in developed countries. Real wages have risen. Living standards have improved. Workers can afford consumption Marx's time could not imagine. However, relative immiseration continues. The gap between rich and poor widens. Workers' share of total wealth declines, and in many developing countries, absolute immiseration persists. Second, the polarization thesis. Marx expected the middle classes to disappear. society dividing into capitalists and proletariat. Instead, middle classes expanded in the 20th century, though they now face pressure and some decline. Third, the inevitability of revolution. Marx believed revolution was inevitable as contradictions intensified. But capitalism proved more adaptable than he expected. Reforms, welfare states, Keynesian policies, consumer culture, all moderated contradictions enough to prevent revolution in developed countries. Fourth, his relative neglect of other forms of oppression. Marx focused on class, sometimes treating other conflicts as derivative, but gender, race, colonialism, environmental destruction cannot be reduced to class. These require independent analysis. Fifth, his insufficient attention to politics and the state. Marx analyzed economics brilliantly, but said less about how political power operates, how states function, how movements succeed or fail. Later Marxists had to fill these gaps. Sixth, his Eurocentrism. Marx analyzed capitalism as it developed in Western Europe. He said less about how capitalism interacts with non-European societies, how colonialism shapes development, how revolution might occur in peasant societies. Seventh, his underestimation of nationalism, religion, ethnicity. Marx expected class solidarity to transcend these divisions, but they proved remarkably persistent, often overshadowing class identity. Eighth, his vision of communist society. Marx provided little detail about how a planned economy would function, how democratic control would work, how abundance would be achieved. Later attempts to realize his vision often failed catastrophically. Marx in the 21st century. Does Marx remain relevant in the 21st century? Many argue yes, perhaps more than ever. Contemporary capitalism faces crises Marx identified: inequality, financial instability, overproduction, environmental destruction driven by accumulation. His analytical tools help understand these problems. Globalization has created a truly international working class. Supply chains span continents. Production is coordinated globally. Capital flows freely across borders. This vindicates Marx's vision of capitalism as a world system. But globalization also reveals capitalism's contradictions. Developed countries deindustrialize. Manufacturing moves to low-wage regions. Workers in different countries compete, driving down wages. Meanwhile, global financial crises spread rapidly, showing system instability. Technology raises questions Marx addressed. Automation displaces workers, creating the reserve army. Platforms like Uber and Amazon intensify exploitation through precarious work. Surveillance capitalism controls workers minutely. These developments echo Marx's analysis of real subsumption. Yet technology also creates new possibilities. Communication enables global organizing. Information abundance challenges scarcity assumptions. Automation could reduce necessary labor dramatically. The question is who controls these developments and for what purposes? Environmental crisis adds urgency. Capitalism's drive for endless growth collides with ecological limits. Marx understood capitalism must expand or die, but a finite planet cannot support infinite growth. Resolving this requires transformation beyond capitalism. Inequality has reached obscene levels. Billionaires accumulate wealth beyond any possible use, while millions lack basic necessities. This concentration vindicates Marx's analysis of accumulation. It also creates political instability, as publics reject such inequality. Meanwhile, alternatives seem absent. The Soviet Union collapsed. Social democracy faces neoliberal assault. No clear path forward exists, but this absence is itself revealing. It shows capitalism's success at eliminating alternatives, at making itself seem inevitable. Yet dissatisfaction grows. Young people face unemployment, debt, climate crisis, while being told capitalism is the only option. This generates interest in alternatives, including socialism and Marx. New social movements draw on Marx, explicitly or implicitly. Climate justice activists recognize capitalism's role in environmental destruction. Anti-racist movements connect racial capitalism to exploitation. Feminists analyze gendered labor and care work. These movements extend Marx while transcending his limitations. The ongoing struggle. Marx saw his work as contributing to human emancipation. He believed understanding capitalism was necessary for transcending it. Knowledge was not just academic but political, a weapon in struggle for a better world. That struggle continues. Capitalism dominates globally but faces mounting crises. Exploitation persists, albeit in new forms. Inequality grows. Ecological destruction accelerates. Wars continue. Misery persists amid plenty, but resistance also continues. Workers organize. Movements mobilize. Alternatives are imagined and tested. Cooperatives, solidarity economies, participatory planning, all experiment with different ways of organizing economic life. Marx provides no blueprint. He offers analytical tools, critical insights, and radical vision. He shows capitalism is not natural or eternal but historical and changeable. He demonstrates that human beings create their social world and therefore can recreate it. Whether that recreation will happen, what form it will take, whether it will realize Marx's emancipatory vision or something else entirely, these remain open questions. History is not predetermined. Multiple futures are possible. Marx's relevance lies not in specific predictions, many of which were wrong, but in his method and vision. His method of analyzing systems, tracing contradictions, understanding history dialectically. His vision of human freedom, of society organized for human flourishing rather than profit. Capital is not sacred text but living work, to be engaged critically, adapted to new conditions, supplemented by new insights. Marx himself insisted on this. His famous motto, "Doubt everything." The system Marx analyzed has evolved but not transcended itself. Capitalism dominates more completely than in his time, but its contradictions have intensified. The need for alternatives grows more urgent. Understanding capital does not provide those alternatives ready-made, but it helps us see clearly what we face, why the system works as it does, where its vulnerabilities lie. It arms us with knowledge for the struggles ahead. Marx spent decades in the British Museum reading room, sacrificing health and comfort, driven by conviction that understanding capitalism could contribute to human liberation. Whether he succeeded is for history to judge, but his attempt remains inspiring. The questions he grappled with remain our questions. How should society be organized? How can human needs be met? How can freedom be realized? How can exploitation end? These are not just theoretical puzzles, but urgent practical problems. Marx believed another world is possible. A world without exploitation, without alienation, without classes. A world where productive forces serve human needs. A world where people control their own lives collectively and democratically. A world of genuine freedom. Whether such a world is achievable, we cannot know without trying. But we can know that the current world, for all its productivity and technological marvels, fails vast numbers of people. It produces misery alongside wealth, destroys the environment while creating luxuries, limits human potential while developing productive forces. Marx challenges us to imagine and fight for something better. Not to accept capitalism as inevitable or natural. Not to believe that exploitation, inequality, and alienation are the price of prosperity. Not to surrender to the idea that nothing can fundamentally change. In an age of climate crisis, rising inequality, financial instability, and political turmoil, Marx's challenge resonates. The system he analyzed dominates our lives more completely than ever, but its contradictions threaten catastrophe. Understanding those contradictions, fighting to transcend them, creating alternatives, this remains urgent work. Capital is a weapon in that fight. Not the only weapon, not a perfect weapon, but a powerful one. It reveals what is, helping us imagine what could be. It analyzes the present, pointing toward possible futures. The struggle continues, the questions endure, and Marx's work remains a resource for anyone seeking to understand the system that shapes our world and how it might be changed. The last words can be left to Marx himself, from the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, a line he wrote decades before Capital, but which captures his entire project. Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it.